Imagine that every time you made a new friend, you automatically had to hang out with their best friends as well. Sounds like all fun and games maybe, until you find out that the cool sentinel you met has a best friend who keeps asking you if he can eat your couch. Such is the life of a Fire Emblem protagonist, especially of the more recent games. While retainers, as these tag-alongs are referred to, are not a new thing at all, the frequency at which they appear has ramped up, to the point it's becoming a problem. Let me explain. We're gonna start with a very brief history lesson here, because while retainers are more prevalent than ever, they are far from new. Marv has retainers in the very first game of the series, and ever since, there have been a few faces loyal to their lord to start your army off before it becomes a ragtag group. I'd say the only main character who doesn't have any real retainers is Ike, and that's mostly because he effectively becomes Alincia's retainer. But when we look at the history of the series in regards to retainers, two interesting things emerge. First, the obvious one. The volume of retainers has changed completely. New Mystery of the Emblem has one of the largest rosters in series history, but not even 10 characters can be considered retainers. Engage, on the other hand, has a roster half the size of New Mystery of the Emblem, but has twice as many retainers. More than half of Engage's playable roster is retainers. There's more of them in this game than students in all routes of free houses combined. While Fates is a little tricky to compare because of the multiple stories thing, a vast majority of characters in this game are retainers as well. But because the roster size is bigger, the percentage of retainers is not as big. However, Fates, Engage, and also free houses do illustrate one very big change in the way retainers are used and portrayed. They are way younger and serve a completely different role in your army. Most older games in the series do have some retainers for you, but they most often fall into tropes that have existed since Shadow Dragon. The pre-promote paladin, the red and green cavaliers, the early archer maybe, those are your retainers, with usually the pre-promote being the true face of the character trope. Jagen, Seth, Marcus, Frederick, they are what retainers used to be. Nowadays, they're usually the same age as their lord, sometimes even younger, and instead of a mentor or guiding figure, they are friends with their liege, and have more or less the same level of experience and view of the world as them. Now, this isn't a problem in and of itself. You can tell a perfectly fine story and make a great game without an older figure guiding our main lord. That doesn't have to affect the quality. However, I would say the way current Fire Emblem uses retainers is definitely beginning to border on a problem, or even several problems if I'm being honest. First of all, it's not good for characters. Being a retainer sounds like a great job in real life, much better than a sellsword, but in a game like this it's the other way around. Character whose only motivation, whose only place in the world is defined by their lord will never make for a compelling character arc and development. Which is exactly why it suits older characters so well. At that age, most people are pretty set in their ways, and while that doesn't mean they can be fun characters, I do think it's fair to not expect a grand ton of character development from them. But having young retainers who don't change or develop, that begins to feel like bad writing much quicker. And while I would say Fire Emblem has evolved from the point that retainers had almost no character traits beyond I follow my lord, Engage particularly shows how they can never be entirely free. So instead of giving these retainers their own stories and goals to work towards, they hand them interests and hobbies and build characters around that. It may sound a little simplified and perhaps even dismissive, but I don't really mean it like that. I think this could work, actually. The big problem is that it doesn't work in combination with a retainer, someone who can't be too out of line and has to be friends with their liege and often also their other retainer. I mean, I used it as an example earlier, but someone like Bunei, why is he here? He's clearly a cook, he wants to cook, he's weird as hell, meaning no one would really want him here. The only reason he is because he's Fogato's retainer. That hurts his character. And I'm not saying the solution is to just cut Bunei. The solution is to get back to the writer's table and think of a better reason why he joins your army beyond because Fogato does. That is what it usually boils down to. It may just sound like I'm ratting on Bunei because he's unpopular, but this also applies to basically every other retainer in Engage. Why is Marin here? She's super cool, sure, but she's only here because of Tamara. Chloe, same thing with Celine, Zelkov with Ivy, Lapis with Alchrist, etc. A few of those can work, that has always been the case. But when you have so many retainers on board and all of them are only there because their royal is, your army starts to feel quite messy. But so far, this is all story stuff. This doesn't impact gameplay at all, it just makes the story a little one note, which is a shame, but there have been great Fire Emblem games in the past where the stories weren't spectacular either. However, the retainer problem also has its effects on the way the game plays, and thus the enjoyment of it. Because beyond being in danger of becoming predictable characters, retainers are also at serious risk of becoming predictable recruits. Engage has one enemy you can recruit, and very little green ones. By far the majority of them join at the start of the chapter, and that has to do with the fact they're retainers. The royals automatically join you, I think that makes sense. Convincing, say, Hortensia or Ivy to join mid-battle would have made for a very weird decision, for example. But because of that, it also makes no sense for retainers to do so. I mean, Kagetsu is at Ivy's side always, so when she joins, so does he, which is exactly what happens in every other chapter, making for an incredibly predictable playthrough. Retainers aren't randomly recruited from villages or from enemy forces. That is understandable and has never been the case, but when nearly your entire roster is retainers, it starts to get old. And what especially doesn't help is that both Fates and Engage have the hard rule of 2 retainers for everyone. No one has 1 or 3, all exactly 2, which means that you're never really surprised by any new recruits. You could have seen them coming the moment you met a new royal. Free Houses barely has actual recruits as a result of their game philosophy, but I think that still works better than the way Engage does it, which nears eye-rolling levels of predictable after a kingdom or 2. I've been ragging on retainers pretty hard throughout this video, I feel like, but I do want to highlight that they can work very well, or at least better than they do in especially Engage. Take Free Houses. You could argue all the students of the houses are retainers to some extent. Although their level of loyalty differs per house and person, they are all here because of their lord, and follow him or her to the end. But there are 2 important distinctions in the way Free Houses constructs its students compared to how retainers work. First, while they are loyal to their house leader, only very few characters are actually defined by them. Dudu and Hubert's entire lives revolve around Dimitri and Edelgard really, but even then, they still have better motivations as to why they are loyal to them than most retainers in Engage. And secondly, and this is even more important I think, some of these retainers dare to push back. Felix would never call himself a retainer, but in function he pretty much is, even though his relationship with Dimitri is quite strained. Ferdinand is in a similar, albeit less harsh position with Edelgard, and Lawrence comes pretty close with Claude as well. Engage doesn't really have anything like that. Zelkov arguably comes closest, but that isn't really rivalry or pushback with Ivy, more apathy. You may have noticed so far that I've been using Engage as an example more than Fates, despite Fates doing more or less the same thing. And the reason for that is because I think it does work a little better in Fates than it does in Engage. And that has everything to do with the fact that in Fates, depending on the side you pick, you either end up with the retainers and royals as your units or enemies, which instantly helps give them some depth that most Engage retainers never get. Not to mention that since Fates revolves so heavily around the story of the royalty, fleshing them out with characters they are close to works very well. Conquest is not just Corin's story, it's also Xander's and Camilla's. Is Engage really Alfred's or Diamant's story? Technically yes, but in practice, it's mostly a Lear's story front to back, and not knowing anyone is their entire thing. And finally, the fact this video has covered the last 3 Fire Emblem games, all showing symptoms of a similar problem, really shows you what the real issue is. It seems like intelligent systems don't learn from their mistakes or successes in this field. I have gone relatively easy on Fate's retainers, but those were already heavily criticized at the time, and yet the Engage crew doubles down on it, while incorporating basically nothing of what went right for Free Houses. So what is going on here? Is Intelligent Systems actually of the opinion this works well? Or is there another reason behind it? Personally, I think there is one that ties back into my point about recruitment. Retainers, in essence, cannot be missed. They belong with their lord, who is obviously unmissable, as they're important for the plot. As such, you suddenly have a huge part of the roster in all 3 most recent games who are not optional units but mandatory ones, and I cannot help but see that as Fire Emblem's version of the death of optional content. This is a thing in the entire gaming landscape in modern times, where unlockable or missable content has been largely removed, partly because some fans didn't like it, but mostly because the money and effort that goes into games has quadrupled. Simply put, if intelligent systems go through the trouble of writing entire scripts for Bunei, hiring voice actors to portray him in several languages, and not just make a quick sprite portrait, but an entire model complete with animations, you simply have to see him. It costs too much effort, money and development time to make content that having you play the entire game without possibly ever seeing it isn't worth it. And retainers are the perfect solution to that conundrum. Now, mind you, this last part is speculation. I don't know whether this is truly the reason. For example, it could also be related to the way supports have become more important, or the fact that IS are always shooting for the next mega popular character, which would obviously never be a character 50% of players might miss out completely. But either way, the point is that while retainers cause problems from a quality perspective, in my opinion, they are convenient for IS to include, more so than sellswords and random warriors. But let's hope they at least try to learn from their successes next time. But hey, that's just my takes. What are your thoughts on retainers in Fire Emblem? Share them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.